I had my hand inside a boot before I'd decided to. There was a rack of them by the door, those thick, round-toed suede winter boots that everyone seems to be wearing lately. The ones that look a little clumsy, a little unfinished, and somehow that's the point. This pair was lined with wool, white, deep, the kind you want to press your whole palm into. So I did. It was warm in there, and soft in a way that felt almost private, like the inside of something alive. The shop was heated to that slightly too warm winter temperature, and while my hand was still buried in the wool, the door opened and a woman came in from the snow. Real snow. It was coming down hard outside, stacking up on the cars. She had a white hat, a red scarf wound up to her chin, and tall boots with the fleece turned out at the top. Snow on her shoulders. She stamped her feet on the mat. And for no reason I could name, my mind went somewhere cold and far away. I pictured a people I had never met and never seen. Furs, ice, a wide white horizon. The Inuit, or my idea of them, assembled out of nothing in the middle of a heated shop while my hand was warm inside a boot. I didn't hold the thought much longer than that. You don't, usually. A picture arrives, you feel its small weight, and then you pay for your things and leave. Here's the part I only learned afterwards. Those boots, the warm, wintry, deeply northern-feeling boots, mostly come from Australia. The wool that had just put a picture of ice in my head was grown under a southern sun on sheep about as far from the Arctic as a sheep can get. I found that hard to hold in one hand. Australia and snow boots. A hot country and a cold picture, stitched into the same object without anyone finding it odd. The world does that sometimes. It lets a thing be made in one hemisphere and mean something in the other, and it never bothers to explain itself. That would have been the end of it, except that around the same time, a certain place started turning up everywhere. It was early 2026. I was on my phone, bored, thumbing past things I wouldn't remember, when an alert stopped me. The American administration, it said, was weighing ways it might take Greenland, and it hadn't ruled out using the military to do it. My first feeling was plain surprise. Force over that. Then confusion, because I couldn't get the shape of it to fit together. And underneath both of those, a smaller and more honest question. The kind you're almost embarrassed to say out loud. What could anyone possibly want with that island, ice-covered, tucked up near the top of the map, about as far out of the way as a place can be? I didn't go and read about it. I just kept half noticing it. After that morning, the word was everywhere I looked. Greenland, Greenland, Greenland. In headlines, in tickers, in the corner of every screen I glanced at. And somewhere around the 20th time, the way any word does when you stare at it too long until it stops being a word and turns into just its letters, it came apart in my hands. Green. Land. I sat with that for a second. A world of ice, of white horizons, and someone, long ago, had called it green. It wasn't knowing something that made me curious. It was the repetition. So I went to look. The first thing I found was the name itself. The Icelandic tradition tells it like this. A man called Eric the Red, came to this cold place and named it Greenland, on the reasoning that a good name would make people more willing to come. That's how the old texts remember it, at least. Not a survey, not a description. A piece of persuasion. Give the place an inviting name and the settlers will follow. It's tempting to stop there and feel clever about it. The oldest sales pitch in the world, and it worked. But that would be too easy. and it wouldn't quite be true, because he didn't entirely lie. Go to the southern fjords of Greenland today, and there is grass. Real, green, grazing land. There are farms there now, sheep on the hillsides, some of them in the same landscape where Eric's own people once kept their animals. The green is there. It was always there. It's just not the part you picture when you hear the name. And that's the thing about a good name. It doesn't have to lie to you. It only has to show you the one true corner and trust you to fill in the rest. And you will every time, in the brightest colors you have. Say green to someone shivering through a northern winter and watch what their mind does with it. Eric, if the story's true, didn't need to invent a single thing. He just had to choose which true thing to say. So, Greenland isn't a lie, exactly. It's something more interesting than a lie. It's a cell that happens to be partly true, which is the most durable kind. And I might have left it there. A neat little story about a clever name if the next thing I found hadn't been so much stranger. Because the thing that actually tied this island to the rest of the world wasn't the grass. It was ivory. Not elephant ivory, walrus ivory. The long tusks of the walruses hunted in the waters around Greenland. For a stretch of the Middle Ages, when a piece of walrus ivory turned up somewhere in Europe, the odds are good it had begun its life here, in the cold sea off this island. For a while, Greenland came close to being Europe's single source of the stuff, the far northern supplier at the end of a very long line. I want to be careful here, because it's easy to oversay. Not every carved tusk in Europe came from this island. But when it came to walrus ivory in particular, this small, remote settlement had come to sit near the center of that trade. So picture it from the other end. Somewhere in Europe, a warm room, a table, a game already in progress, a hand closes over an ivory chess piece and moves it. Or a craftsman sets a pale ivory cross into place. And that object, small and precious, and entirely at home in its European room, might well have begun as a walrus hauled out of the water at the edge of the known world. Between that room and that water lies the whole distance nobody at the table can see, the hunt, the cold, the long haul south by ship. Hands the carver would never meet. The piece on the board gives none of it away. It sits there, pale and finished and perfectly composed, looking for all the world as though it had always been European. That was the part I hadn't expected. The grass kept people alive on the island, but it was the ivory that connected them to everyone else, that made this place matter to a continent which would otherwise never have thought about it at all. They didn't live on the grass in the end. They lived in a way on teeth. And then the part that's colder than any weather, tastes change, fashions move. Slowly, across the 14th century, Europe simply wanted less of what this island had to sell. The appetite for walrus ivory thinned out. Other ivory was moving through the markets, and the old northern supply began to feel less necessary, less current, less worth the trouble of reaching. You can see what that did faintly in what the hunters left behind. Later, they seem to have gone farther for less, traveling greater distances, coming back with smaller animals, a shrinking return on a longer and colder journey. The later remains tend to be smaller creatures brought from farther off, which is the sort of pattern you'd expect when a hunt is under strain, though the bones themselves can't tell you exactly why. They were working harder and harder for a thing the world had begun to shrug at. There's a small, cold detail I keep coming back to. By the late 13th century, Rome was asking for the island's church dues in silver or gold rather than in tusks. A settlement at the very edge of the map was being told that what it had to give must first be turned into the form the center would accept. There's a particular bleakness in a sentence like that. A faraway office, adjusting a column, with no idea and no need to know who was out on the ice to make the numbers come right. I don't think any one thing here was the villain. It wasn't a single market event, a single rival, a single decision. It was quieter and worse than that. They went farther and farther for a smaller and smaller return. And the world they kept reaching towards had simply gradually stopped needing them to reach it. The cold part isn't that the market turned against them, it's that it didn't even do that. It just looked elsewhere. So what happened to them? There's a version of the ending I first heard years ago, and I'll be honest, I liked it. It goes like this. They were too proud. Stubborn northern farmers who refused to change, who wouldn't lower themselves to hunt seals the way the Inuit did, who clung to their cattle and their old ways while the cold closed in around them, and so they starved. A tidy story, a little tragic, a little deserved, the kind you can nod at and file away. It was so tidy that I went to check it, and it doesn't quite hold. When you look at what's left of the people themselves, at their own bones, at what their bodies were actually built from across the generations, the diet doesn't sit still, it moves. Over the centuries it shifts away from the land and towards the sea, more and more of it drawn from the water. These were not people who refused to change. They changed a great deal. Whatever ended them, too proud to adapt, is not a full enough answer to carry the weight. And that's where something turned over in me. Not out there, in the history, but closer in. Because the moment the tidy story cracked, I noticed how badly I'd wanted it to be true. How ready I'd been to believe they had earned it. I had to ask myself why I'd reached for that version so quickly, and held on to it so tightly and been so reluctant to set it down. Why there had been something almost like relief in it. The last clear thing we have of them is small and oddly ordinary. In 1408, at a church called Hvalsey, there was a wedding. 2 people were married. Someone was there to see it, and someone thought to write it down. And that record made its way out into the wider world, where it could be kept. You keep waiting for the next thing to follow. A note about a harvest, a ship, a death, a name, the year after. That's how records tend to work. One entry leans towards the next, and then the writing stops. That's the last of it. Not a battle, not a catastrophe on the page, not a final entry announcing the end of anything. A wedding. People standing in a church, doing one of the ordinary things that people do. And after that, from this place that had supplied a continent, the record simply goes quiet. There is no next page. There is only the quiet where the next page would have been. I've thought about why that quiet is so hard to sit with. And I think it comes to this. We need to believe they did something wrong. We need there to have been a mistake, the pride, the stubbornness, the refusal. Some flaw we can point at and say, there, that's the thing that did it. We reach for the flaw almost gratefully. Because think about the other version. If they did nothing especially wrong, if they adapted and worked harder and reached farther and were simply slowly let go of by a world that had stopped needing them, then their ending wasn't a punishment. It was just something that happened. And if that can happen to people who did nothing wrong, then nothing anyone does is a guarantee against it. Then no one is safe. That's the thought I couldn't put back down. Not that they failed, that they might not have. The ice is retreating now, and as it goes, the island is being looked at again. There are a few plain facts, and I'll leave them plain. Beneath the ice, Greenland is thought to hold real deposits of the rare and critical minerals a modern world runs on. The United States already operates a base in the far north called Pituffik Space Base. And in the surrounding seas, more ships are passing than there used to be. I'm not going to tell you what any of that means, or what anyone intends by it. I don't know. And the not knowing is the honest part. I only notice the shape of it. A place is worth something. Then for a few centuries it isn't, and it's left alone. And now, quietly, it's worth something again. And the world remembers where it is. It's the same island the whole time. The ice, the rock, the water off its coast. None of it has changed its mind about anything, or asked to be wanted, or noticed that it stopped being wanted, or noticed that it started again. What keeps changing is us, out here, deciding every few centuries whether the place is worth the trouble of looking at. The island never set its own price. It was only ever worth what someone far away decided to pay for it. I live on an island too, as it happens, down at the other end of the earth, about as far south as this one is north. We also make things for distant places and let distant places decide what they're worth. So far they still want what we have,